So let's take a look at layers inside of ZBrush. Layers allow us to isolate either sculpting or polypainting or the positions of models and general subtools in layers, much like you would in Photoshop, for example. Now, the first thing that you might notice is there is a layer menu at the top of the screen. This is not 3D layering. This is 2.5D layering. This is from the beginning of ZBrush. This is for using ZBrush as an illustration tool, and these really are not used anymore. This is purely here for backwards compatibility, so disregard this layer menu. All these menus at the top of the screen are kind of global settings. The layers that we're going to use are associated with our Z tool, so we'll find them under the tool menu. Remember, everything under the tool menu relates to whatever is on your screen at the moment being sculpted or painted. So under tool, we have a layers menu here. Now you can see that we don't have any layers assigned yet, and we have a variety of buttons down here. So we're using our alien bust, and there's already some poly paint on here. What we'll do is we'll isolate some skin markings in layering so we can try different variations of stripes and spots and whatnot. So under the layers menu, you'll notice that the big button here is new. If I click this, this will create a new layer. Now, whenever I create layers, I try and create them at the highest subdivision level. That's because if I want to go back and change my layer settings, I need to be on the layer where I created, or on the subdivision level where I created that layer. So it's easier to keep track of it if you just make them all at the highest subdivision. So if I click new, I now have a new layer. It's untitled. You see that the slider activates. It's currently at 1, which is 100%. And you'll also see that it is in record mode. Now that means anything that I change on this mesh now will be recorded into this layer. So if we were to just take the move brush, for example, and I can make a couple changes here. We'll just grab the mesh and just create some bumps on the head here. We'll do the same thing down here. Just make some very obvious changes. Now, I want to stop recording my layer. So I'm going to click right next to the record button, and that's the eyeball button. That tells me that this layer is visible. So I'm no longer in record mode. If I turn the eyeball off, it turns off that layer. If I turn it on, it turns that layer back on. I can now use this slider to dial back the strength of that layer, and I can even go into negative values, pushing in what was sculpted out. Now, if I come back and try and sculpt again, it's going to give me a message that I have to activate layer recording mode. So once you have started creating layers, you must have a layer active and in record mode to do any more sculpting and painting on your character. That's why I typically use them at the end of my process when I want to start experimenting with variations, because I can find it a little bit annoying to have to keep a layer just for general sculpting. For me, it's easier to use them to organize the finishing passes. So let's take a look now at how to manage this layer. If I want to change the name, I can click the name button here, and I'll just call it test layer. Here I have the option to duplicate it. If I duplicate the layer, it will double up the strength of what's in there. So I now have 2 layers stacked on top of each other. If I turn off the visibility on one, you see it dials back to the original. Turn off the visibility on the other, and we get back to our original model. I can delete a layer just by clicking the delete button here. I can, here we go, let's go back to invert. I can invert the layer, and that will invert the effect of that layer. So remember when we dialed the layer back to a negative value, it pushed in instead of out? Well, this just inverts whatever was placed inside that layer. Now, these are undoable options. I can go back to before I deleted my original layer here. Now you can tell which layer is selected because it will have this bracket around it in the list. Come back up here, select this layer. Now I've got the option here to, there we go, merge down. This means that I can take this layer and I can merge it into the layer beneath it. We also have the ability to split layer. If we have painting and sculpting in a layer, we can split those two into different layers. Now, if I'm happy with the changes that I've made, I can click Bake All, and that will bake all the layers and delete them. So it basically applies those changes to my model and gets rid of the layers. Now I can come back here and sculpt as normal without having to have a layer in record mode. We can import, or excuse me, we can import MDD animation data. MDD is a portable file format that ZBrush uses for a couple different things. Here you can actually import this animation data into a layer if you choose to. And you can click record deformation animation to MDD files, so you can actually export an MDD file from ZBrush. These are not necessarily used very often. For my own workflow, I focus on using layers for sculpting and painting, much like you would in Photoshop, like I said, just to organize your changes into modular units that you can turn on and off and experiment with. So I want to turn off visibility on both these layers, and I will bake all, and that just gets rid of them and removes their influence. So let's try to do a painting layer. I'm going to create a new layer. Again, we are at the highest subdivision level. I'll go to the standard brush, make sure RGB is turned on, and turn off ZAdd. I'm going to change my stroke to a spray stroke, and I'm going to dial back my color to 0 on this stroke. We'll learn more about this in the painting chapter. We're just going to paint some stripes on the skin, and this just makes sure that the color selection stays consistent. ZBrush doesn't modulate it. I'll change my alpha, which is the brush shape, to these little random dots. And then let's grab a color. Let's put some sort of purple stripes on here. So I've got my X symmetry turned on, and we'll just zoom in. Turn my draw size down. And again, our brush is only adding RGB. It's not sculpting. And we can just do some sort of random painting here. Now, as I'm painting into a layer, if I hold down the Alt key, it's going to erase. So I can't erase out from what I'm painting here, which is a very handy thing to be able to do. I'll rotate around here, and let's make another stripe up here. And I'll hold down the Alt key and just erase out from some of that. I might change my brush shape from these little dots to this larger, chunkier, random alpha here. There we go. That gives me a lot more aggressive of a marking here. Do another little stripe through here. Let's erase out from the edges of that just to make it a little bit more of an interesting form. Let's bring that stripe all the way up to here. And we'll erase out from that. I find these very, very helpful in the concept process, where you don't want to commit to any particular idea yet. You want the ability to showcase several different potential variations. And by storing these sorts of skin markings in a layer, it allows you to very easily access them and isolate them later and even combine them if necessary. So it's a very, very powerful tool. So let's change our draw size, make a larger stripe back here, make them bigger as they get further back the head. Do another one here. We'll do another one through here. And again, we'll erase out, holding down the Alt key. My alternate color, the second color selection there, is black. So typically when you're pressing the Alt key, it's painting in the alternate color selection, which you'll see that when we do our painting chapter. But in layer painting, that's going to erase. So let's make another stripe back here, bring this down around the neck. And I don't have to worry about making them too opaque yet, because remember, we can double up our layers. This is falling into shadow, so I'm going to go to my light menu, and I'm going to turn on a secondary light. I'm going to bring that light up here to about 3 o'clock, and that just gives me a little bit more light coverage there as I'm painting. Let's do another stripe here. And then let's do some spots going around the back here. A little smaller one here, and again, let's use the Alt key and just carve out a little negative space in that. We'll take my draw size and turn it down so we get a little bit of a sharper brush here. Here we go. We'll do a secondary color in a moment, but we'll break that out into a second layer. Let's bring this down here, bring this down, sharpen this up a little bit. And I'm just going to carve out some negative spaces in that. Make these ones coming down the face get a little bit sharper and finer. And I'm going to turn off my X symmetry because we don't really want the skin markings to be perfectly symmetrical. That'll stand out and look strange. I'll turn it back on, paint some stripes coming through the shoulder area here. And again, I'm holding down my Alt key just to erase a bit from those edges, and then I'll turn off the X key, or turn off X symmetry by pressing the X key, and I'm going to add some asymmetrical detailing here. And then I'm going to change my stroke to drag rectangle and turn my draw size up and my focal shift down. And now if I click and drag, I can drag out these sort of dot patterns like this. And we'll keep these asymmetrical. There we go. So now we've created these stripes in a layer. Now, if I click next to record, we are now in layer view mode. We're no longer recording, so I can no longer paint or sculpt on this character. I can drag my slider down and I can change the opacity of that layer. If I drag it into the negative, see what that does with poly painting, as opposed to what we got with the sculpting. If I duplicate my layer, it's going to double up the intensity or the opacity, as you see there. If I delete that layer, it takes us back to where we were originally. So let's create a new layer now. I'll create a new layer, and I'm going to adjust my color. Let's make this much, much, much darker. Or actually, instead of that, let's grab some yellow. So let's come through here. Now we can add some painting here. So currently, this layer is my active layer. And if I start painting these sort of yellow dots here, you see what happens. Now, if I want to change my layer organization, I can click a layer and drag, or I can click a layer and drag it, or I can use this button here. Shift up, it moves that layer up. So you see that layer is now moved up. Let's turn visibility back on. Now, notice what's happened here. The layer on top sits beneath the layer underneath it. So that's an important distinction to understand. Unlike Photoshop, where the layer on top is the layer on top, in ZBrush, the layer on top is the layer on the bottom of the stack. So as I start drawing now, oops, I need to turn on record mode for this layer. Go back to visible mode. Now you see that layer sits beneath the one underneath it. If I click this button and move it down, now you see it sitting above. Move it up, and it's sitting below. And when we are in record mode, it's always going to appear on top. So we're not going to see the layer organization otherwise. I'm going to undo that and turn on, well, actually, let's just go ahead and make this asymmetrical. I'm going to turn on record again. There we go. Make sure that I'm on the right layer. It's always good to name your layers so you know exactly what you're selecting, because it very quickly can get out of hand and you've got too many layers to keep track of. So we'll just drag these bits through here, creating a nice little broken up patterning. Now this is quite a strong sort of color contrast, but we'll be able to adjust our opacity on the layer and then change that. We also have a chapter on adjust color under Polypaint. So it is possible to isolate colors using adjust color and then change its opacity, change its intensity and saturation, all of its RGB and HSV values. So let's put some more of these down here. Let's put some bigger sort of dot patterns down here through the chest. There we go. Now we'll click next to the record button to go into view mode, and then we'll just dial back that opacity. And now you see we can make that much more muted. Turn off visibility on this one. We lose our stripes. Turn it back on. Let's select this one. Now, if you find it hard to select a layer without actually changing the slider value, you can use these arrow keys. These will actually select the layers, and then this will move the layers. So we can grab this now, which is on the bottom. It's the yellow layer, and we can turn that up. And I'll click the name button, and we'll call this yellow. And we'll click the down arrow to select this one, and we will name this one purple. Now let's say that we wanted to add some sculpting in these layers. So let's do that now. Let's add a new layer. And we will name this layer wrinkles. Now this wrinkle layer is in record mode. Now I'd like to illustrate that you do not have to be on your highest subdivision level to record into a layer. If I press Shift D and step down my subdivision levels, the layer menu doesn't let me access the settings here anymore. However, I'm still in this layer and I am still in record mode. So if I were to take the standard brush and let's just reset it back to the dot stroke and maybe alpha 1, turn off RGB and turn on Z add, now we can start adding some wrinkles here. So let's say that we want to change these shapes around the face here. Let's add some bigger wrinkles here. So I'll take the standard brush, and I really like to sculpt form from the lowest subdivision level that will support it. I'm a big fan of sneaking up on shapes, as you've probably heard me say in some of the other videos. I'll turn on X symmetry just to expedite things. So what I'll do here is I'll start putting these changes in at the lower subdivision level, and I'll step up with the D hotkey. And let's go ahead and take the trim dynamic brush and just knock back the top of that fold a little bit. And I'll take the damp standard brush and start to carve in some more wrinkling here. I'll add some bigger changes through the lip area here and through the mouth. I will turn off X symmetry here. Anytime I get close to the center line of the head, I think it's really advantageous to turn your symmetry off for your detailing, because it's just very apparent if you've got symmetry in those particular areas. I'll take the clay tubes brush and change to alpha 1. That softens the brush. Make sure that you're just on Z add. You don't want to add any color into this layer. We're just using this layer for sculpting. Let's bring this little fold around the underside of the jaw here. I'll turn my focal shift down a little bit so the brush has a bit of a fall off. And now in smooth, make sure you turn off RGB on your smooth brush so you're only smoothing form. The smooth brush will, by default, smooth polypaint as well. So going back to my damp standard brush and then my clay tubes brush, just building up some shapes here. I'll mask out this port here. And I'll take my move brush and just pull this down a little bit, and then control click on the background to invert that mask, and then scooch that under that mask. It just helps make a little bit of a sharper crease kind of in that area where we're making these sort of jowls. Take my move brush and just scooch some of these shapes down a little bit. Go back to my clay tubes brush with X symmetry turned on, and I just want to fill out the hollows in these cheeks a little bit. I think they may be too hollow, so let's bring some more form up in there. Connect that up to that cheekbone. And I'm going to mask out the corners of the mouth here. I'm going to unmask this area here, so I can just take the move brush and sort of pull this skin over that. I'll control click on the mask to soften the edge of it. And then I'll control click on the background to invert that mask, and this just helps us create a little bit of a crease there. We can adjust that with the move brush, and then take the inflate brush. Make sure we have a low Z intensity, and we can sort of pucker those shapes together and get a nice sort of crease jowling kind of effect there. Now if I step back up a subdivision level, got a bit more detail now. I'll take my dam standard brush, and we're still in record mode on this layer. However, we still can't see it because we're not at the subdivision level where we created the layer. So we're sculpting in it. We're able to use the layer, but we can't go in there and turn it on and off anymore because it's at a higher subdivision level. So here I'll just put in some random sort of creasing. Doing a little crisscross pattern with my dam standard brush here. I'll turn off X symmetry, just to put a couple asymmetrical details up here in the cheek area. There we go. Now we'll step up another subdivision level, and now we're at the top. We're at level 5 where we created our layer, and you see it's still in record mode. So I will click the little icon next to it, and that puts us into view mode. So we're no longer recording. We are just viewing at this stage. So if I try and sculpt, it won't let me. But this does allow me to change the opacity on this so we can dial back those changes. We can invert those changes. It sort of creates those shapes and pushes them in rather than out. And this is really nice when you're detailing because you can be a bit heavy-handed and then use this slider to dial back the intensity on the changes that you make. Now, had I gone into this layer and, let's say, went to the standard brush with RGB and no Z-add, we can also put Polypaint inside of the sculpting layer. So if I turn on record, now I've named this wrinkles, so I probably don't want to paint in it as well, but you can paint in these layers. Let's turn off record mode. Dial this back. You see that Polypaint dials back with it. And now we have access to the split layer button. So if I were to click split layer, I could split the Polypaint and the sculpting into 2 different layers. So if you were to accidentally paint into a sculpt layer, you can split them out. Or perhaps you're sculpting a wrinkle and you have RGB turned on your brush, so you want to actually get some color into the recess of that wrinkle. You can then later split those 2 out. So it's quite a handy thing to have to be able to split those layers out that way. I'm just going to undo back before that. So let's take a look now at another use for layers. So we can use layers to store Polypaint and sculpting information, but we can also use them to store pose information, so we can create blend shapes with layers. You'll also notice that in the Z plugin Transpose Master, which we have an entirely different chapter that discusses, we have a layer option here. So when we pose our characters, we can have our pose information stored in layers here. So that's very, very handy as well if you want to keep your neutral pose but have a asymmetrical pose stored in a layer. So let's take a look now at creating some facial expressions on a character using layers for blend shapes. So here we have our ogre model open. We're going to open up the layers palette here and geometry. You see we're at our highest subdivision level and we have no layers assigned yet. We're going to use layers to create facial blend shapes here. So I'm going to start by creating a new layer, and I'm going to name this mouth close. And we are in record mode. Now I'll just step down my subdivision levels. Take the move brush, and I've got X symmetry turned on. And this is a symmetrical model, so it'll be pretty easy for us to make these changes symmetrically. I'm just going to bring that lip up again. And I'll use the masking brush to mask out that lower lip, and then Control-click on the mask to feather the edges. I'm going to mask out the nose and the eye area here. These are things that I don't want to affect inadvertently with my brush. So now I'm going to take the move brush, turn the draw size up, and just start to bring that upper lip down. Now while we do that, the compression in this nasolabial fold is going to reduce. So I'm going to go to the smooth brush and turn my Z intensity down, just do a little bit of smoothing there. be careful not to obliterate your sculpture, but you just want to make sure that the shapes, the forms of the face react to the change in the facial expression. Just invert my mask, revisit the lower lip, and bring this one up. Bring this corner up, and I'm just going to Control-click to feather that mask further. Bring that up, and then Control-click to invert the mask. And I need to sharpen this mask up, so I'm going to use the Control key. Another neat trick is if you hold down the Control key, you can go to the mask pen and change this to mask lasso. So in a situation like this, it might be easier just to lasso around the specific vertices that you want to actually mask out. So if we do this, there we go. And then we'll take the move brush, pull these down, invert that mask, and then pull these up. Now, when you're using the move brush, if you touch with the move brush, then press and hold the shift key while you slide, it'll slide faces along the surface of the model. So it's an interesting little hotkey that's kind of hidden there in the move brush. There we go. We've got the lips closed now. We have the mouth closed. Let's step back up our subdivision levels with the D hotkey. Very good. Now, I'm going to make sure I'm at my highest subdivision level and click next to record. So we're in visibility mode now. So now I can drag the slider down and we can see the animation of those faces changing. Let's create a new layer now. And let's name this layer nasolabial. Lower. Nasolabial folds are the big folds of skin that you get on either side of the nose. If you crunch up your face in kind of a grimace, you'll see those appear. So we want to lower those. I'm going to step down my subdivision levels. And I'm just going to include the wings of the nostrils in this as well. The wings of the nostrils, let's change back to our mask pen. The wings of the nostrils are the nose holes, essentially. So we're going to mask this whole area out. Because he was making a grimace face, those nostrils were raised up. They were pulled up on the sides of the nose. So we'll bring this down, give ourselves a little bit more of a neutral expression there, and just do a little bit of smoothing through here. Just knock that back a bit. Let's clear that mask and make sure that we don't get too much of a distortion in the nose there. We'll bring this, oops, right there. I don't want to grab the eye, so I'm going to undo that and just make sure that I mask out the eye, because we want to be really careful when we're making facial expressions that we don't move points in our layer that are not related to what we're trying to move. So let's bring that nose down a little bit. There we go. And we'll step back up our subdivision levels with the D hotkey. And there we go. So now if I grab the slider and move it down, it'll automatically put us into view mode. And we can watch those shapes change. Turn that back up. There we go. So let's go ahead and create a new layer. We'll call this one Smile. We are in record mode. I'm going to step down. It's always going to be easier for you to move faces at a lower subdivision level. So we're just going to grab the corners of the mouth here and just pull these up and back a little bit. Just give him a nice little smile. And we can go back to our highest subdivision level. And now you see that layer is still in record mode and accessible. So let's go ahead and click next to the record button. And if I want to neutralize this, I can set it to 0 and the smile goes away. So let's make a new layer. We'll make this brow furrow. We'll call it brow furrow. And I want to open the mouth again because this brow furrow is going to relate to the snarl. So let's set this to 0. And look how strange that looks without the nose being part of that snarl. So we'll click this layer here and set this to 0. So now our nose is back in there. Smile is set to 0. Let's go back to brow furrow and click the record button next to it. So now what I want to do is I want to give some forehead component into this snarl. So I'll mask out the bridge of the nose here. And I'll mask out the bony landmarks at the corner of the eye socket. And then I'm just going to take the move brush and I'm going to slide these faces in. Bring them down a little bit and out. Let's compress using the corrugator muscle there, that brow line. I'm going to invert that mask, and there's a little crease there, a little bit of crease there. I'm going to raise that up and take the damn standard brush and just deepen that crease just a little bit. Turn off my X symmetry. Let's put in some nice new wrinkles here, some new forms. I'll step up a couple subdivision levels so I can see this properly. And we'll deepen these existing wrinkles a little bit. I have a little seam there. Let's go ahead and smooth that out. There we go. And we'll step back up to our highest subdivision level and turn off record mode. Now if I dial this back, the brow returns to a more neutral position. Dial it back up, we get that furrow. So we've created a variety of facial expressions here. Let's do one more. Let's make the ears wiggle. So I'm going to create a new layer, call it ear wiggle. And we'll step down to a low subdivision level, go into frame mode, and I'm just going to mask out the tips of the ears here. Control click on the background to invert that mask, and then control click on the mask to feather it. Then I'll go to the rotate tool, and I'm going to turn off the gizmo, so we're using the transpose line. Now, if you don't know how to use the transpose line, we have an entire video on posing and transpose, so we talk about this, but just a quick update or a quick review. The transpose line, you draw it by clicking and dragging on the model like this. So what I'll do is, oops, let's focus in on the screen again. I'm going to draw a transpose line along the length of the ear here, and I'll click on, I will click on the orange circle so I can move it, and I'm just going to put the end point there around the middle of the ear, like that. Now, in rotate mode, if I hold down the Alt key and then click, I can sort of wiggle the end point there. I'm going to take the line, though. I'm going to grab the outermost circle here and bring it like this so it's more of a straight line across. So let's go ahead and wiggle that down a little bit. Take the move brush and just fix that little compression there. And let's do something similar for the other ear here. Go to transpose rotate, draw a new transpose line here, and we'll hold down the Alt key and click in the outer circle. There we go. We just get a little bit of movement in the ears. Step back up to our highest subdivision level. Turn off record mode. And then we can drag this back down and those ears will return to their normal position. So we can put a little wiggle in them if we want to. Now I know I said that was our last layer, but I tell you what, let's do one more. There's a platysma muscle. Usually you get these sort of cords of muscle along the neck here when you snarl. If you look at a mirror and make a big grimacing face like this, you'll see these ropes of muscle there. So let's create a new layer. Name it. We'll just name it neck for the sake of brevity and clarity. And we are in record mode. We'll step down our subdivision levels. And I'll take the standard brush with alpha 1, and I'm just going to very quickly, oops, I've got RGB turned on. Make sure that you're on ZAD and not RGB. I'm just going to build up these neck muscles here, these sort of ropes of muscle, the platysma muscle. I'll go in with my clay tubes brush, and I want it to sort of traverse across that wrinkle there, so let's bring that up like that. There we go. That way you don't have the muscle with a wrinkle running through it, which really doesn't make sense. It should be stretching the skin underneath like that. There we go. And we will step back up to our highest subdivision level and turn off record mode. Now we can dial this back to 0. So now that we've got these, what do we do with them? Well, you can export these as blend shapes to Maya. If you step down to your lowest subdivision level, there's actually a ZBrush plugin that will allow you to work with blend shapes and Maya in that way, and ZBrush. It's also possible if you watch the video on FBX, import-export, you can export layers using your FBX files. But the most direct and simplest way to deal with them in ZBrush is to use them for animation. Yes, just like we do in the chapter where we create a animation movie from our history timeline and an animation turntable, we can use layers, timeline, and animation to create videos of facial expressions. And this has been very, very useful for me since this was first available in ZBrush to do proof of concept. For example, you're working on a film and you need to illustrate how does this particular vampire's jaw function. If you've got a vampire with a very strange jaw configuration, or a creature with a strange sort of mandible, well, you can create animations in ZBrush of facial movements and positioning, and then render them directly out of ZBrush without having to go into Maya and render something from there and animate it from there. So let's take a look now at how we do that. So let's go to the layers here and let's zero everything out. So we'll make sure this is set to 0, 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 and this is set to 0. Now we'll have the neutral position of our character. Make sure that brow furrow is set to 0. I'm just double clicking on it, pressing 0 and hitting enter, and that turns off visibility on those layers. Now, if I want to create an animation, I will go to the movie timeline. Let's close out of our sidebar here. Let's go to movie, timeline, show. And this will show us the timeline here. Now, the first thing you need to do whenever you're using timeline is to create 2 keyframes, and that's going to be our camera. So our 2 keyframes are here. Now, if I move the camera, I can use the left and right arrow keys to bring that camera back to the original position. And I use this a lot in ZBrush. You'll see me use this in texturing, and I'll use this as I'm sculpting to sort of store views. I'll use it as a backup for image plane registration. So it's a handy tool to have. But before we do any sort of animation in ZBrush, we have to have those 2 keyframes first. Now we're going to keyframe our layers. So let's go ahead and select, just by double clicking on mouth close. Let's turn on visibility on mouth close. Make sure we're at our highest subdivision level. Bring this down to 0. Now, I will click here and see it has set a keyframe for mouth close. So if I want the mouth to close, I'll move forward to, let's say, here. I'll change this to fully on, and then add a keyframe here. Now, as I drag along the timeline, you can see that animation take place. I'd actually prefer this to start with a closed mouth, though. So let's go ahead and get rid of our keyframes. How do we delete keyframes? Well, to delete a keyframe, and by the way, you can use your arrow keys here. Oops, there we go, to move between them. Let's go ahead and click and drag that keyframe off. That drops that keyframe into the document window. Do the same thing here, and those are now gone. Got mouth closed set to 1. I'll click a new keyframe here at the very beginning. So we start with the mouth closed. Let's go ahead and hit the down arrow here. So we've got nasolabial lower. Since our mouth is closed at the start, let's turn this all the way up so it's in keeping with that neutral position, and let's add a keyframe there. Smile we don't need, brow furrow we don't need, nor ear wiggle or neck. So now we've got our neutral position on the face. So I'm going to move forward to the point that I want the expression to start to take place. So I want the face to be neutral for the very, very beginning here. So I'm going to go ahead and click again the nasolabial lower. And I'll use the arrow keys here to select my layers. And you can see the ghost of that other keyframe there. I'll put the next keyframe, mouth close, right on top of it. So this gives me a bit of time at the beginning where the face is neutral. So now if I move my timeline forward to here just by clicking under it, let's take mouth close and let's turn this down to 0. So I'll press 0 and then I'll put a keyframe here. So now if I drag along here, you'll see what happens. We go from neutral to the mouth opening. Now, while that mouth is opening, we want the nose to be not furrowing. We want the nose to be raising and the nasolabials to be creasing. So our nasolabial lower layer here, we have a neutral keyframe for that. We could put the keyframe for this at 0. So let's set it to 0 so the nose comes up. Now I can set this keyframe right there on top of the original or a little bit before it. That's called overlapping action in animation, where one action completes just before or just after another. So it's not everything ending on the exact same keyframe, which can make things feel a bit strange. So you see that gives us the nose raise, and it finishes just before the mouth is completely finished opening. So let's look at our other bits here. We've got the neck control here. Let's go ahead and use our down arrow to get to that layer. So I'm going to keyframe this at 0, at neutral, and let's move up to here, and we'll keyframe it again here, and then we'll move up to this point where the creature is starting to snarl, and let's set this to 1. That brings the neck muscles out, as you see, and we can then keyframe that there. So we get this full range of expression through those overlapping keyframes. Now, let's go ahead and go to smile. We haven't tried smile in conjunction with these other facial expressions, so let's see what happens. I could put a smile hotkey here for neutral, put one here for neutral. Let the snarl happen here. Put a keyframe there. And then let's see what happens if we move past the snarl a little bit, and let's make the smile come into play. Oh, that's a little bit creepy. I'm not terribly happy with this distortion here, but you could go ahead and re-sculpt something like that. Actually, it's not too bad. It just requires a little bit of attention, as blend shapes always will. We can dial that back a little bit. There we go. So let's do this. Let's go ahead and set our keyframe for smile. Make sure that we've got smile set to neutral. So let's go ahead and set this to 0. There we go. Smile is set to neutral here. And then we'll come to here. And then let's set smile to 1. And keyframe that there. Now what we'll do is we'll overlap some of that action. I'll go back to that previous keyframe where the smile is just starting. And let's see what happens if we take mouth close and start to bring this down a little bit. Put a keyframe here. Let's see what happens if we combine that with the smile. Now let's turn this down to 0 at this point. Oops, 1, I mean to say. And then put a keyframe here. So now we'll get a snarl with the neck muscles. Then we'll get a mouth close and a grin. Now in that snarl, we forgot to bring in our brow furrow. So let's come back here to our neutral. All right. We'll go to brow furrow. Down arrow, down arrow, down arrow. Brow furrow is selected. Let's put a keyframe here for 0. Keyframe here for 0. Then we'll come up here to the snarl. And let's let that brow furrow extend a little bit past the snarl before it becomes 100%. Set it to 1. And then put a keyframe there. So now as we scrub through this, you'll see the creature starts to snarl, the brow starts to furrow. It doesn't reach its full potential until the end. Now he's going to be starting to smile, so let's put a keyframe there for the brow furrow at its maximum, and come back here to the end of the smile, set brow furrow to 0, and put a keyframe there. And there you go. You can scrub through all that animation. Now, as I said, you can actually write these out as videos because it's only so useful to have it here locked into ZBrush. We'd like to be able to get a video out from it. So let's take a look at how to do that now. So what we'll do is we'll go to our document window. We'll turn off constraint proportions and set our resolution to 1920 by 1080. And click resize. Say yes, and that's going to drop the image on canvas. So Control N to clear the canvas, and then we can zoom out, draw our character on screen again, go into edit mode with the T hotkey, and then zoom in, get a nice placement on screen here. Now, here are my 2 keyframes for the face. I'm going to drag these off, and I'm going to create new keyframes here. So this is going to be the view that we have of our character. Go to the light menu, go to my key light, and then I'll just move this over here so it's a little bit more dramatic. And if you want to learn more about rendering, we have an entire video on rendering and a video on rendering beauty passes and doing beauty turntables and beauty renders out of ZBrush for video. So make sure you watch the video on turntables as well to supplement this information on movies. Okay, so we're going to make an animation. We're going to write an animation from this. So I will go to the movie menu, tear this off. I will go down to title image, and we'll turn title image fade in and fade out down to 0. That's a little watermark that goes over the video, and we don't want that for this particular one. Or excuse me, that's the title image. The watermark is the overlay. We'll turn the opacity down to 0. Now you could make your own logos and put them in there, but for the purposes of this video, we won't do that. Now we have timeline, and we have timeline tracks. Now here is where you can actually control all the different tracks that are available for the timeline. Now we're doing camera and we're doing layers, but you could also do a transparency track. You could turn something transparent or opaque. Z-spheres, you can track Z-sphere actions, wireframe, background changes. So anything that you've got in here, it is possible to timeline animate. So there's quite a bit of animation options available in here. So let's go ahead and come back up to our movie options here. So you'll see that we have got window, document, large, medium, small. We're going to set it to large, set it to document. There we go. Now I am going to, underneath the timeline here, I am going to press Control Shift and then click. Now what that's going to do, it's going to walk through all those frames from the first keyframe ending on the last keyframe. And it's going to write out each one of those frames to the frame buffer. So we'll let that go, and we'll be able to play our movie here. You can watch over here, the layers are actually interactively changing. It's kind of interesting to watch that take place. And there we go. It has completed writing out those frames. So if we come up here and click play movie, we can see the resulting movie that's been written out. There you go. Now, if you want to write this movie out, perhaps you want to save it as a video file, turn on export high quality and click export, and then you can export this as a video file from ZBrush. If you want to save these frames as they are without compressing them or anything, just save them as a ZBrush file. Now, these won't save the individual frames. It will save out as a ZBrush selection of frames. You can click Save As, and that will save a ZBrush movie, which is essentially just the frames brought together so they can be loaded back into the frame buffer. Now, if you want to change your timing, you can change your timing just by clicking and dragging these keyframes around. So, for example, if I want the animation to run longer, I can click and drag this keyframe and move it. If I want to change the keyframes on, let's say, the smile, maybe I want the smile to last a little bit longer. So I will click and drag and move these timelines around, move these keyframes around. If I were to right-click on the timeline, I can expand it, and left-click on the timeline, I can compress it. So you can actually expand and compress how much time is actually visible on your timeline. So that completes this look at using layers in ZBrush. We've seen how to use layers for polypainting. We've seen how to use them for sculpting and detailing. And we've also seen how we can use them to store facial features and facial expressions and render out animations directly from ZBrush. So I hope you found this video helpful and you can find new ways to incorporate layering into your own workflow. So I will see you in our next video. Thanks for watching.